Okay, so everyone, I'm Kate McPherson. I'm Narragansett Bay Riverkeeper with Save the Bay. And the Riverkeeper program got started, well, the Keeper program has been around for about 30 years, and you may know about the Baykeeper, Narragansett Baykeeper. Our current Baykeeper is Mike Jarbeau. He goes out on the water, he does water quality testing, he looks for things like oil spills, threats to the bay. He also helps to comment on environmental laws that might make protection of Narragansett Bay stronger. And so the Riverkeeper program is a relatively recent program. It started in 2017. And I am tasked with looking at environmental issues that happen in Narragansett Bay's watershed. So we've got a number of different watersheds that all lead to Narragansett Bay. We've got the Blackstone River, we've got the Taunton River. Most of Narragansett Bay's watershed is in Massachusetts, actually, about 60%. When you think about Blackstone all the way up into Worcester and Whitingsville and Blackstone and like all of those towns just north of Rhode Island. And then the Taunton River watershed, so thinking Fall River, Freetown, Brockton, the city of Taunton itself, that entire watershed is in Massachusetts, and it drains to Mount Hope Bay, which is just that northeastern corner of Narragansett Bay. But it all drains to the bay. We're in Wakefield right now. The Saugatucket River drains into Narragansett Bay. And one of the things when I first had a lovely conversation with Uli, you asked me, I remember, you're like, what is one environmental issue that is underrated? And so I thought a little bit, and I was like, you know what, this concept of buffers is something that not a lot of people know about, and I think if they're pretty simple to understand, and it's just like a matter of thinking about things in a different way. So thinking back to why a watershed is important to Narragansett Bay, no matter where you live in a watershed, and no matter what you're doing on the land, eventually everything rolls downhill and gets either into groundwater or maybe into surface water. And so development in the watershed can definitely impact the receiving waters and the receiving estuaries, the bay, eventually the Atlantic Ocean. And so it's great because all of us has a little bit of power to do proactive things and do good for the watershed, and maybe think a little bit about what are we doing in our day-to-day that may be less good for the watershed. And so thinking about, okay, what are the important pieces of a watershed? How does water, or how do pollutants get into our rivers and streams? And then how do they flow downhill? And so thinking about Rhode Island has a wealth of freshwater wetlands, and that's what my background is. I'm a freshwater wetland biologist. I love birds, I love plants, I love to identify, where those marshy, wet seeps, springs, bogs, where all those are in the landscape, because I could talk for a long time about why wetlands are important, but let's just assume that freshwater wetlands are very important for wildlife, for water quality, as food sources. So things like high bush blueberries like to grow naturally in swamps. And so thinking about, okay, so we know that wetlands are really important, and wetlands often occur along rivers, and thinking about why we might want to protect the water that rolls downhill into these wetland areas. And that's what a buffer is. So a buffer, when we're thinking about water quality, is a natural undisturbed area that sits right upslope. So you can see we're right here on the Saugatucket. If you look right over here, we've got some bushes, we've got some trees, we've got some leaf litter. So it's November, so the leaves are starting to fall. We still have a bunch of leaves that are clinging to the trees, but leaves have fallen down onto the ground. We've got some tall grasses, we've got vines, and a lot of complexity. And so the best buffers are complex, so lots of layers. So when I think about a buffer that is really functioning well, that is doing the best that it can for the wetland or the stream or the pond that is downslope, I think like, all right, well, what's on the ground first? And looking down into what the soil looks like, that mostly decomposed leaves all crunched up, and then the freshly fallen leaves, so a little bit looser, a little bit fluffier on top. And then thinking about things, so we're in Rhode Island, and the natural habitat that wants to just crop up is forest. So if you leave a piece of land untouched, undisturbed by fires, by deer, by mowing, by livestock, it's going to grow into a forest in a matter of like 3 decades. So that's kind of how the land wants to spring back. And so when you think of like a fully developed forest, the next layer above the leaves are going to be things like ferns, things like princess pine, lycopodia, which is a kind of moss, a whole different family of mosses. And so those small, sometimes tender, sometimes they'll die in the frost, but sometimes persistent. They're pretty robust. They'll stay there even when it gets frosty. And then you have shrubs that maybe, so we've got some like low shrubs, like there's some beautiful inkberry back there that's pretty much as tall as it's going to get. It's about 5 feet tall. We've got these knee-high shrubs called huckleberries that, like, if you've ever walked through a huckleberry forest and an oak forest, they're pretty low and they provide like a really good ground cover. And then you get some saplings. That's sort of like the next story. Young trees or very mature shrubs that are maybe 15 feet tall. And then you have got canopy. So a fully mature tree can reach 100 feet in either direction. And all of that layer and all that complexity is really important when you think about how pollutants get into swamps and streams and Narragansett Bay. And the one of the biggest threats to water quality is stormwater. And so when I picture stormwater, I like to think of these heavy, like, downpour storms that we're getting more and more frequently. So especially in the summertime, but now it's any time of year we're getting these storms. Clouds roll in, it rains really, 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 really hard, sometimes for a very short period of time, and we might get like an inch of rain in an hour or two. And so if you don't have this really complex buffer forest between paved areas like roofs, like paved pathways, paved driveways, roadways, then the water hits those hard surfaces and just flows downhill, flows to the low spot in the pavement. And if there's grass all the way down to the river, the water will just roll down that grass right into the river with no stopping and no treatment. And so that could potentially be really bad, because if there's oil that was in the roadway, that's going to get mixed up with that stormwater and go right down into the river. If somebody was walking their dog and didn't pick up the poop, any bacteria that's in that is going to get mixed up with the stormwater and roll right down the hill. And so a little bit of that isn't too terrible, because, things can get diluted, and especially if the water body that's receiving it is pretty big. But in Rhode Island especially, our watersheds are pretty developed. So there's lots of people living in them. We have lots of infrastructure. We have lots of houses. We have lots of roofs. We have lots of really hardscapes. And wouldn't it be nice if, hundreds of years ago when we first started developing Rhode Island, we were like, okay, we really can't build anything within 100 feet of these wetlands, these swamps, these rivers. That's just not practical. And so one of the things we were talking earlier about, how we've been coping this week with, political events and news. And one thing that I did on Wednesday, I was like, I need to get out of the office. I need to be out in the fresh air and do something really productive. And this is great if if you're a renter or somebody who lives in a condo or somebody who cares about your green spaces but may not be a caretaker of a green space, of a lawn or of an outdoor space. So what I did was I went down with my colleague Dave and we put a rain garden in at Frosty Drew Nature Center in Charlestown. And so have any of you heard of rain gardens in the past?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm seeing some no's. So a rain garden is it's a garden that is placed relatively close to a school or anything with a roof. So you could put a rain garden on a really large barn or a shed. You could put it next to your home. If you have a library that you love, you could contact the folks that run the library and see about putting a rain garden in. Save the Bay has put rain gardens in at town halls. So they're really great for publicly owned properties. It's good for folks that want to get involved in a project. And it collects in a shallow depression. They're typically only like 6 inches to maybe at its deepest 12 inches. So a basin is created to collect the water from the downspouts. So at the corners of buildings, very often you'll see downspouts. Sometimes you'll get like a gully where there's erosion because that water isn't seeping into the soil. And the garden helps to collect that water and slowly percolate it, like you're making coffee, percolate it down into the groundwater. And it's important for stormwater to not run right off into the river. If it gets down into the groundwater first, there's a whole host of bacterial processes and physical processes that can break down any contaminants in that stormwater before it gets into the natural resource. And so it took us, I'm sure Dave did a bunch of preparation, but it took 3 folks a couple of hours to dig it out. We put native plants in, plants that will tolerate like a wide range of moisture levels.
Can you give some examples?
Say it again?
Can you give some examples?
Ah, yes. So we use plants that are native to Rhode Island. We planted some goldenrod. We planted some inkberries. We planted some coneflowers. And actually it was really quite striking because within, I'm not exaggerating, minutes of putting in the goldenrod, we had a monarch butterfly come by and start pollinating. And so I know I've been talking a lot about water quality benefits of buffers, but really the benefits are tremendous because especially in wetlands and in buffers in Rhode Island, these are some of the few areas where we actually have land protection in place in Rhode Island. That's where all the wildlife lives. So migrating songbirds, lots of mammals use the buffers along rivers to get from place to place, either lower in the watershed or higher in the watershed, finding new breeding grounds, finding mates. So if you can picture a river and how the river comes from small little streams to bigger little intermittent streams that might go dry during a drought or in the summer months, to rivers that typically hold water for most of the time, unless like this year we've had a pretty significant drought, to the lower perennial rivers like the Saugatucket, which very rarely goes dry. I've never seen this river dry before. This is sort of the most mature stage for a river, right before it hits the mouth. And animals go up and down in between all of those little myriad habitats. And so if you don't have a green space, putting rain gardens in public places is an awesome way to sort of replicate some of the functions, water quality functions of a buffer, and then also to put in some of these native plants so that pollinators, especially birds, if you put seed producing asters, we used some New England aster in the rain garden. So birds will come and find seed sources and pollinators, and so you can have like a little oasis in this sort of sea of lawn. And so lawns are we live in a culture where folks value a very green lawn and a big expanse of green, but personally, I never see wildlife in a big green expansive lawn. Very, very rarely. Maybe you'll see a robin or two, but if you're using chemicals to treat the insects underneath the lawn, you won't even see robins. So what I want to do is give you permission to stop mowing. I've done this at my house. I know lots of folks that, like in Providence, like have no-mow lawns. One of my good friends is a no-mow. I mean, I'm going to use the term lawn because it's a familiar term, but green spaces, you know, these little oases, these little, we like to call it rewilding a part of your lawn. And this is a fantastic time of year to do it because we have all these leaves that are either have started to drop or about to drop. And so you can kind of create a wild space in a tidy way because, like a lot of folks, I do like to have like boundaries and borders. So I might have an area where it's mown and it's green and like a formal garden, but then also I love to have those wild spaces. And thinking, the buffers that we've been talking about right now have been buffers between the water or the wetlands and the development. But a buffer can be any natural space between two things. So you can put in a buffer between your house and your neighbor's house, and you can create that. You're still going to get that water quality benefit because no matter where you live in the watershed, if you can infiltrate water down into the grounds, it's going to be better than wherever it eventually reaches. It'll hit a storm drain, potentially, depending on where you live, and it could just get... So infiltration is really like key here. And so what I've been doing is, the easiest method is to just stop mowing and stop raking. And if you've got oak trees, you'll get a nice thick 4 inches under your oak tree and it'll kill the grass. So you don't have to worry about too much about grass coming up, leaves go down. So I have a big area on my back side yard where I'm just kind of minimal. I'm just gonna let nature sort of rewild. But in my front yard, where I want to put a buffer between an area that I have like a fire pit and some green space where folks can come and park, and my neighbor, there's already some saplings, there's some mature trees, but there was this big 30-foot area where I kind of didn't really want to mow, like it wasn't really grass. I was thinking to myself, gosh, wouldn't it be great to just put a buffer in here, you know? And so, but I also don't want the leaves to blow around. I kind of want a defined border between a lawn and a buffer. So you can incorporate landscape features like a low row of rocks or bricks or some sort of barrier that helps define to yourself, okay, I'm gonna let this go, you know, I'm gonna let this rewild. And also it can be a signal to anyone living at your home that helps with the outside maintenance, or anybody who you might bring in to help with outside maintenance. And then if I'm mulching leaves in my lawn to help as a natural fertilizer, I'll take some of those mulched leaves from the mower and I'll place them down in an area where I'll actively want to kill the grass. And the mulched leaves blow around less. So you get that nice thick layer of leaves right on top. And then all you have to do is wait. It's really fascinating because, like I mentioned earlier, Rhode Island wants to grow into a forest. So if you stop cutting, you will get seedlings of all sorts of things. And so for a water quality benefit, it doesn't necessarily matter what types of plants are growing, but if you also want that wildlife benefit, then what I would do is go and like pluck out all of plants that are not native to Rhode Island. So these non-native invasive species. So these aren't things like irises that you might plant on purpose, or ornament like bulbs, tulips, daffodils, that sort of thing. Those things aren't native, but they're not invasive. They're not taking over. They're not physically killing trees and shrubs and ground covers that want to be here naturally. And so things like autumn olive. There's a field near my house where a lot of autumn olive have come in, and the birds love to eat the autumn olive berries, and so the birds spread the seeds in those berries, and before you know it, if you don't know what an autumn olive looks like, you can have a full field of bushes that are all the same type of bush, and that's just not healthy for wildlife. It's okay for water quality, it's not great for wildlife.
Didn't they plant a lot of those?
Yes. So one of the biggest tragedies of, and it's directly related to buffers, is in many decades ago, land managers would plant quick growing plants to help stabilize slopes. So, and that's sort of another aspect of a buffer that I haven't really touched on, is how the roots of the plants that are in your buffer help keep that soil, especially on a hillside like this, in place. And you can see this hillside is eroding a little bit where there aren't any plants. And so if the leaves were allowed to sort of, first of all, if there were plants there, the stems of those plants would physically trap those leaves. And then the leaves and the stems combined would help to trap seeds before they'd roll right down into the water. And so you'd get more variety. So something like this looks like it needs a little bit of help. Maybe just putting some sticks down, putting some temporary erosion controls that will biodegrade over time to help trap those leaves. Maybe some plantings. You know, you can go to home centers now. I know of at least 2 in Rhode Island that specialize in native plants, and there's lots and lots of companies that specialize in it. And you can seek to physically plant in a buffer. So in fact, in my sort of side yard buffer that I'm putting my mulched leaves into to help actively suppress some of the grasses that I like, the lawn grasses that I don't want anymore. I've planted a native redbud. There's a program run through DEM in cooperation with National Grid, and it's called this Energy Saving Trees program. And so if you plant a tree near your house, you can save energy in the summertime because the shade from the tree helps to cool your house. And you can save energy in the wintertime because if it's a deciduous tree, the leaves fall and you get the sun coming in. And so it's not just for energy savings though. If you plant trees and like try and get a little bit of a rewild, so it's one thing to plant a tree and then like maybe mulch it with wood chips and rake all the leaves. You're just getting one small benefit. But if you plant that tree, and you plant a couple more trees, or maybe you plant some shrubs nearby, and you let it rewild, then you're putting in a buffer. Then you're creating this little corner of wildness where animals can come, especially birds, because birds have incredible mobility, and they can really just zoom in on these oases of nature and stop and get what they need and then move on. And so planting trees and landscaping definitely has its place. But I also really want to encourage folks to like just put in like a little bit of a wild area where the leaves stay, where maybe you're encouraging natives to grow and you don't even have to go plant them. You can just see what grows. If you don't know how to identify a non-native plant, that's absolutely a tricky thing. But with the internet, we have so many resources available to us. I know cooperative extensions often have a list of like the 10 or the 20 worst offenders. Universities, I know URI has a list of identification, like how do you identify autumn olive? How do you identify multiflora rose, which is another one of those species that were deliberately planted to help stabilize slopes, and they grow in full sun, they grow in full shade, they grow in wetlands, they grow in uplands, so really they'll grow anywhere and they will take over an area. But typically, if you don't know what the problem shrubs are, you can definitely find someone who does, or I mean you can contact Save the Bay, because myself as Riverkeeper, I'm pretty good at identifying non-native plants. We also have our restoration habitat team also very involved with restoring native habitats. Part of that, a big part of that, is keeping out non-native plants so that the natives have the ability to flourish. So there's definitely resources.
So can people can anybody call you and say
Sure.
I have this lawn and this stuff is coming up, can I send you a snapshot? Can you tell me whether I should let it grow or whether it will kill everything else? Can people reach out to you?
Absolutely. Yeah.
that's something
Especially with really
important.
clear photographs. So in case you couldn't hear Uli's question,
Yeah.
she asked if anybody was like, oh gosh, what is this plant that's growing up in this buffer that I want to create? And whether or not they could send that photo to me or somebody at Save the Bay. And the answer is absolutely yes. Also, other resources, URI has a fantastic plants program. Rhode Island Natural History Survey keeps lists of, especially if you have a plant that maybe you know a little bit about non-native invasives, and you see a plant, you can kind of tell if something's taking over. And with the advent of the internet and being able to research things on your own, it's cool to reach out to folks like at the Rhode Island Natural History Survey. But also, I just remembered, I use a program on my phone called Google Lens, and you can take a picture of a plant and it'll tell you what the plant is. So I use that program all the time to get me in the ballpark. Like, okay, is this a reasonable guess for what kind of plant it is? And then I'll go to a field guide. So yeah, definitely try Google Lens. If you get stuck, you can send it to experts like me. We could absolutely try and help you out with identification.
And natural history, Rhode Island Natural History Survey is also part of this program.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So people can choose either.
Yeah.
And they have their fingers on the pulse of like what brand new plants that folks like me may not know about yet.
Yeah.
So
Because they're constantly doing research.
new plants and new
yeah.
animals are coming in all the time. And so there's a little bit of a difference between non-native and non-native and invasive. So, but unfortunately, you kind of don't want to wait to see if it's going to be
Yeah.
invasive, especially with a small population. You want to kind of try and get it
We
first.
ended up with one of those olives, which I always thought was called Russian olive or something.
There's 2 different species.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't know what it was then, but had the berries, and the birds loved the berries, and we thought, oh, that's nice. And then we read about what it was, and we cut it down.
Yeah.
Yeah. You did the right thing.
And we haven't had any other one grow back, so.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good.
And I want to see how this looks. What does it look like?
It's got silvery. So on one top, it's like sort of light green. It's a beautiful bush. So I know why people would plant it, but it's got light green with like speckled silver on top, and then you flip it over and it's silver on the bottom. The berries are these fairly large, maybe this big, bright red, bright scarlet red with little silver specks. They're edible to people as well. They're very sour. So not highly palatable, but you can eat them. They make your mouth pucker. Bitter, a little bit bitter and a little bit sour. And they have a really big seed, one big seed per berry, but they're a high source of carbohydrates for birds. So that's why they love them. Birds are just
But when
trying to
you
eat.
say that, it sounds like having one bush, like what Barbara describes. One bush could be good.
Well, one bush can lead to many thousands
Yeah.
of small
Yeah,
bushes.
because the birds eat seeds.
Oh,
And
right.
berries,
Yeah.
And
spread
carrots.
seeds,
So
yeah.
then you can't control it.
Right.
So in my neck of the woods, there is one neighbor with one bush. and that one bush is responsible for, gosh, 3,000 little
Oh
tiny
my
little
God.
ones. And so, I mean, part of it is education. I've talked to my neighbor and I'm like, gosh, let's go on a plant walk.
Yeah.
Like I would happily, flag these plants, help you come up with a management plan, because sometimes You can't just cut it once, especially with something that's very tenacious like that. You got to keep cutting it. Got to keep cutting. But I also want to encourage folks to not let that be a barrier to putting in a buffer, because especially for water quality benefits, it doesn't matter what species of roots necessarily are in the ground holding the soil and holding the leaves that can help coat. And one thing that I don't think I fully described is this concept of when stormwater happens, and it's pretty easy. Okay, stormwater hits your roof, it runs down, it hits the gutters, it runs down the drain pipe. You could hear the water running down your drain pipe, and then it goes out and away from your house. And that's typically when we stop thinking about stormwater. Where does it go once it hits the drain pipe? Okay, well, maybe you'll have a little bit of an erosive gully, or maybe it eventually sort of finds a low spot and percolates in. Maybe it hits a storm drain in the road. But have any of you been in a forest when it starts to pour raining? So you have about half an hour before you actually get wet when it starts to rain in a forest. And the reason for that is because when you think about this concept of layers, rain's going to hit that canopy layer first, and the leaves aren't going to absorb the rain, but the rain will coat all of the leaves. And so it'll coat the top surface, the bottom surface, all of the twigs in the canopy. It'll start to drip down the trunk of the tree before all those leaves get fully saturated and with the surface tension, can't hold any more water, and then it's going to start dripping down onto the next layer, which is your sapling layer. And if your saplings have leaves on them, the same thing is going to happen on sort of a much smaller scale, because the big canopy trees are so enormous. And then it's going to drip down onto those lower shrubs, which again, like, aren't they don't have a large volume, so their surface tension can't hold on to as much as like a big tree. And then it's going to hit that fluffy leaf litter layer, and that's a good 3 years of all of the canopy down on the ground. And so I really can't stress this idea of leaf litter enough, because it's got so much surface and so much capacity to hold life for wildlife. So a lot of the insect prey that many of our birds are going to eat are in either the leaves, either alive, or the leaves on the ground dead. And if you have a forest in a rainstorm, it takes a really long time for that floor to get completely saturated. I would say like a very severe downpour or an all-day rain. And then if you've spent a lot of time in the forest doing field work, or just enjoying nature at all times of year, it stays wet for a long time. So it's not like if you are downtown here and a summer rainstorm blows in, it's wet, and then the clouds go away and all of a sudden everything's dry, that maybe the sidewalk's steaming, but there's no more wet surfaces minutes after a hot day rainstorm. In the forest holds on to that water, and it will keep dripping for about a half hour after the storm is done. So it helps to really slow down the process of water rolling downhill. And so it's a cool thing. Like, you can't just snap your fingers and get a forest next to a water body. But over time, you can try and build in, starting with this leaf litter layer, build from the bottom up. So planting in like lots of low little ground covers, or I like to place sticks and twigs to trap leaves, and planting a couple of saplings if you have that in your budget. Choosing native plants, and it's something that I've been working on for a long time, just encouraging, being curious, seeing what grows, trying to stop less valuable plants from taking over. But it's a process, and it's very rewarding. I think the wildlife aspect is what I get the most personal satisfaction out of, but also knowing that there's that additional bonus water quality aspect is just really nice as well. So
when people now in the fall, they rake their leaves, I just read some incredible amount of leaves end up in the landfill and actually take huge parts of the landfills up, right?
Yeah, and that's unbelievable to me,
Yeah,
because
it's really
it's like you're throwing away this really good natural resource. And so if you're raking leaves, it means you have a green space to rake. I don't have a leaf pile on my property per se. What I do is, even if I was like, rewilding, not for me, you have the opportunity to have a bay-friendly lawn by not using fertilizers. So if you choose to mow your leaves right into the lawn, if you don't wait for a really big accumulation, those leaves can, together with the grass clippings, can provide a pretty good ratio of nitrogen to so phosphorus is contained in a lot of these oak leaves, a lot of the dry brown materials, and then nitrogen is contained in those green grass clippings, and together, just left on your lawn, will help feed it just over time. And so you can have a nice green lawn without applying any additional fertilizers and without the added work of taking away all those leaves, because it's work, like we all live in Rhode Island, we live in New England. It is so much work to try and get rid of all of your leaves. So if you have spaces where you may want to remove some leaves from your lawn, but if you have this rewilding area where you can spread out those excess leaves and try and get, so instead of having a big pile, but like spread it out and let the trees and the saplings come in, then you have those sort of two benefits. You have that aesthetic green look that many, many folks crave, myself included. I have a piece of my property where it's green, and I have some leaves mulched in and some grass clippings mulched in, but it looks tidy. And then I have these wild areas where I've given myself permission to let go of the process and to see what comes in. And often those are just so rewarding. And I would not have designed it. I'm not a landscape architect. But it's so nice to see what nature designs when you give it permission, when you let go.
We've been trying to let our lawn go to moss. We have a lot of shade. And so we haven't fertilized in years, and we have more and more moss growing. And last year we left the leaves. We didn't rake in the fall. We left the leaves all winter, and then in the spring we kind of raked cleaned a little bit. But there are some bare spots, some really bare spots. But overall, we've got moss, and then you get the little violets in the spring, and I love I don't mind the dandelion.
Yeah, dandelions are one of the very first spring bloomers, and and even though dandelions are not a native species, they're not invasive, and they're really important as like that first pollinator species for bumblebees, for honeybees, and for a whole bunch of native pollinators in the spring. So I'm with you. I leave the dandelions.
We have a lot of so it's really kind of woodsy around us.
Mm-hmm. And that's a nice thing too. If you have a little bit of woods around you, you've got that seed source, and so you can see, okay, what's going to drop in. And this sort of like builds upon what Hope's talk last month with native seed sources, and how the plants sort of save their own seeds, and how you can proactively save seeds. So if you watch Hope's video, then maybe you can be a little proactive and self-select with some acorns or some aster seeds or some Joe Pye weed.
I was gonna say, I loved you mentioned at least 2 or 3 that she had come across just here locally. So
there's a tremendous amount of native trees and shrubs in this park. It's really nice to see. So.
I was going to ask you, to maybe in a wrap up, if we can look around the shore here.
Yeah.
And I'd like to hear what you would recommend.
Sure.
Different spots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one personal question. We've been promoting the growth of clover, full white flowers. And because I don't mind white flowers when they're blossoming, and then otherwise you get a lot of nice green, which we do enjoy, and no fertilizers or anything. And does that seem like
Yeah, so clover is a natural fertilizer. Clover is part of a plant group that fixes nitrogen. So in a relationship with bacteria in the roots, it helps to make nitrogen available to other plants. And nitrogen is something that a lot of folks will apply to their lawn because it helps things green up. So clover is an excellent lawn species to have. And that's another thing that I'd love to touch on. If you want to have a lawn, it doesn't all have to be one species. It can be 50 different species of all of these green things that are soft and tender. And I experimented this year with only mowing my lawn once a month. And I will fully admit, in May, it was really hard to wait until May 31st to mow my lawn. But I'm so glad that I did, because I found all of these spring blooming wildflowers that I didn't know I had. I had so much wildlife, so much wildlife in my lawn. And then, so that was just spring. But then in fall, when I let some of those 20 or so green species in my lawn get like, maybe 8 inches tall, it goes to seed. And in the late afternoon, I would get flocks of sparrows coming through, eating the seeds in my lawn, flipping over leaves, looking for food. And I'm a bird lover, and lots of folks enjoy seeing wildlife. And there's just something so nice for being able to see your efforts at trying to be a little bit more bay friendly, like paying off with the wildlife that come through. It's so cool. So this is actually a really great spot to take a look, because you can see an example of a bad buffer and a good buffer.
Yeah.
So you can see over on the other side, there's a lot of lawn and not a lot of leaves. And you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 really obvious spots where the water can, from the parking lot, from the roof, from the road, can just get right into the river without any roots or any leaves or any buffer stopping it. And so you can see there's trees along the river, which is really important, because those roots are physically holding the bank of the river, and they're physically holding that bank back. And then you can see where there's shrubs, it's even better, because the shrubs sort of overhang the water a little bit and provide a spot for fish to have a little bit of shade, provide a spot for waterfowl, lots of ducks on this river, just a spot for them to sort of look for food and get cover. So, and it traps. So you can see it traps some of the trash and man-made stuff too, but it also traps leaves, and it traps sediment, and has that water quality benefit. So, but then if you look on our side of the river over here, you can see it's still not very big, but it's doing a good job of buffering. It's doing a good job of blocking the development. So we could hear the cars across the river. We can't hear the cars on this side of the river, even though there's a street back there. And part of that is because we've got trees that are really overhanging. We've got shrubs that are overhanging. We've got some wetland species, that sort of dark, fluffy, low shrub that looks like it's growing out into the water. That's swamp loosestrife, and that's physically helping to hold the banks in. So we have that physical holding the banks in, but then you can see right under these red maples, there's leaves in the water, there's leaves on the ground next to the river. There's places for birds to perch. There's probably little wildlife trails. If I was a mink, or I was, let's use the example of mink, because they're a species that will definitely use rivers to go up and downstream. I'd prefer to stay on this side than that side, because there's cover, there's food. I can get down to the water, but then I can get back up onto the land. And so it's just, it's blocking the noise and light from the traffic, from once the sun goes down. If there's lights on these buildings here, the stems are physically blocking the light. If there were coniferous species in here, evergreens, that would do a good job of blocking light. And so you can see how bigger is going to be better. So even if all of that green space across the river was trees and shrubs, you'd still kind of be able to see the houses beyond that. And so the wider the buffer is, the more buffer you can put in, the better water quality benefit it's going to be for the river. And so because those buildings are so close, it's like, okay, well, I see a downspout there, and I see a downspout there, and I see a downspout there. Like, can we put a rain garden in over there? Where does the rain naturally collect? And is that going to be a good spot to try and capture that rain before it gets down into the river? And so those are things that we think about at Save the Bay. We want to make sure that the water quality improves, doesn't get any worse, for the sake of the river itself, but also for the sake of the downstream water bodies and folks that live downstream, animals that live downstream. So we're all connected through water one way or another.
What does the day of a riverkeeper look like typically?
So Uli asked, what is the typical day in a riverkeeper's life? It's a great question, and it's a question I don't have a really good answer for because all my days are very different. So I love when I have the opportunity to educate about, okay, well, what is a buffer? What are wetlands? I mean, I said earlier I could talk for a really long time on what is a wetland and why is it important. But things that I've done, I've been with Save the Bay since 2018, and some of my major achievements might be commenting on the state's rules and regulations to protect freshwater wetlands and to protect rivers and to make sure that we have the maximum protection that the science says is required. So we've talked a lot about buffers and how they're benefits for wildlife and how they're benefits for water quality. Well, for water quality, the buffer only needs to be 80 to 100 feet wide to get 100% water quality, really good water quality benefits. But if you also want benefits for wildlife, the buffer needs to be like 2,000 feet wide, miles. You need miles of forest to be able to tick off wildlife benefits for all the species that might live there. And so that's not practical in some areas, but let's fight for the best that we can get with the knowledge that that's not going to be possible everywhere. I also do things like practical on-the-ground applications. So helping Dave build a rain garden, helping folks do freshwater restoration projects. So I recently, in the Taunton River Watershed, did a plant study looking at the uniqueness of the plants that were growing in an area that used to be a cranberry bog that's been left for about 6 or 7 years now. So they're getting lots of plants coming in, and how unique are those plants? And then let's restore this cranberry bog. Let's take out some of the sand that's been dumped on it over the decades, and let's take out the dams that are controlling the water levels in this former cranberry bog, and let's try and rewild it. And then after that work is done, after that restoration work is done, what plants are growing there? How unique are they? Are they more unique or less unique in general than the ones we found before any work was done? That's the type of work that I really love. So river restoration, freshwater wetland restoration. We work a lot doing dam removals or trying to advance dam removal projects, because we've learned, and you can see those floating buoys are sort of a warning to boaters that there's a dam just downstream there, and be careful, don't go over the dam. But we've learned that dams are not great for river health, and we have 997 dams in Rhode Island alone, and most of them aren't doing anything. Most of them aren't producing hydropower. Most of them aren't producing any sort of power for the mills that are all throughout New England. And so sediment is backing up behind the dam. These ponds are filling up. The water quality is not good behind many dams. The oxygen levels are too low, especially in the summertime, for things like turtles and things like fish, things like aquatic invertebrates. And so we're trying to change this thinking of dams in the state and make it easier for, in situations where it makes sense, where it's going to be healthier for the river, to get some of those dams removed.
So were they initially put for mills?
Yes. Power to run like grist mills,
How many mills do we have now?
cotton
Yeah.
mills, like and the mills that we do have are not run on river power anymore.
Right.
They're run on electricity.
Yeah.
So, so yeah, there's lots of river issues, freshwater wetland issues, and like I said at the beginning of the talk, anywhere you live, you're in a watershed. You may not be in the Narragansett Bay watershed, but you're in some water body's watershed. Anywhere you
That's
live.
interesting.
So it doesn't matter. Nobody's in their own isolated bubble. I've been saying buffer too long. Nobody's in their own isolated bubble, and so how you choose to live or landscape, or asking your elected officials or your representatives in town or your librarians, whomever is responsible for keeping green spaces, like getting involved and trying to get a little bit more infiltration or a little bit more rewilding is going to have a tremendous benefit.